Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our Bible class on the life of David. Today we are in Lesson 10, entitled David Becomes the King. We're looking in our Bibles at 2 Samuel chapters 1 through 4. And we're looking at 4 chapters, but we're looking at the very beginning of David's reign as king in Israel. The book of 2 Samuel opens, and David hears about Saul and Jonathan and their death. It comes from a young man who was an Amalekite. If you look in verse 8 and verse 13 of 2 Samuel chapter 1, he comes in with torn clothes, with dust on his head, just the signs of great mourning and distress. And he tells David that Saul, Jonathan, and Saul's other sons are dead, verse 4. But to report on all this means that you would have had to have seen or obtained some very specific information, some specific knowledge about how this took place. And so David asks him for proof in verse 5. And so this young man, this Amalekite, shares how he was with Saul, and Saul asked him to kill him. And since he didn't think that Saul would live, he killed him, and he brings David the crown of King Saul. Well, this account differs from what we read in 1 Samuel 31. It's a carefully crafted story here. It seems as if this Amalekite was lying in order to receive credit from David for killing his arch enemy Saul. Well, David responded to the news of Saul and Jonathan's death in two ways. Number one is that he kills the messenger, verses 14 and 15. I mean, you think back during 1 Samuel and David's journey, running as a fugitive of Israel, David refused to raise his hand against Saul on multiple occasions. He refused to do so because Saul was the Lord's anointed. He felt terrible guilt just off of cutting his robe. Do you remember that? So, given David's convictions about the matter, about striking down Saul, when this young man came in so very boastful that he killed King Saul, do you expect David's response any different than to bring about swift justice on the man who did something so very foolish and hasty? The irony is that this young man lied in order to gain David's favor, and yet it was the very lie that brought about David's response of taking his life. The second thing David does is that he mourns and he laments. We're looking at verses 11 and 12, but really it's a greater section of verses 17 to 27. The reaction of David to Saul and Jonathan's death is very likely not what the Amalekite expected. I'm sure he thought that David would be so pleased that his enemy, King Saul, was now going to be removed. But there was much to mourn. There's a lot to mourn in the eyes of David. Saul's anointed, the Lord's anointed, King Saul, his closest friend, Jonathan, a broken house of Israel, the king, the first real king of God's people, all of this now gone and ended. There's a lot to be sad about. And so David in verse 17 down through 27, he sings this song, this lament, entitled The Song of the Bow. It's a very, very fitting title. I mean, Jonathan was very proficient with the bow. You see in verse 22. Jonathan helped warn David about his father's intentions with the bow. 1 Samuel 20, we read about that. And Saul, ironically, was slain with the bow. That arrow pierced him and critically wounded him. 1 Samuel 31 and verse 3. Well, you notice of Jonathan, he calls him a brother in verse 26. He describes his care towards David, Jonathan's care towards David, as just very pleasant. And he saw his relationship with Jonathan as the closest relationship he had apart from God. It was closer than any other. He says even more than any of women or his wives. He just had such a special, close, fond relationship with Jonathan. He writes about Jonathan and Saul, and he talks about their weaponry. He attributes their weaponry to the honor and bravery that they displayed in the battlefield, down to verse 22. That's what just how beloved they were, how pleasant in life they were, how they weren't parted in death. They died together. They were swifter than eagles, stronger than lions. You just hear such glowing honor David bestows even on someone who was his enemy. He says in verse 25 and verse 27, "Oh, how the mighty have fallen." I mean, these are high praises for someone like Saul. I mean, his song of lament was free from his flaws. He didn't mention all the evil that Saul did, all the years that Saul was a fool, and all the people that Saul innocently killed along the way. No, he focuses on the good in Saul. He saw his bravery. He saw the good that he had done for Israel, bestowing wealth and favor down in verse 24. He talked about the bravery he had in battle. He chose, rather than expressing his bitterness, whatever bitterness might have been there over the years that Saul took from his life, having to run. No, he chose instead rather to focus on the positive attributes. And I think there's a lesson there for us. We can be so consumed with the ways that we've been hurt by people in our lives that even when they're long gone and it's far in the past, those wounds and those pains are just as real today as they were back then. Well, take a note from the life of David, because here, even though Saul is gone, he chose to see the good and to focus on the good. Because if David continued to allow his life to be plagued by Saul after Saul was gone, that's not Saul doing it to David. That's David hurting himself. That's something I think a lot of people miss today, is that when you really choose a path of grace and forgiveness, when you choose to let an offense go, to overlook an offense, as the Proverbs would say, you're really setting a prisoner free. You're not setting the other person free. You're setting yourself free from the pain and anxiety of the past. Well, you see, in verse Ezekiel 33 and verse 11, I want you to listen to what was said here from God through his prophet. Ezekiel 33 and 11, it says, "Say to them, as I live, declares the Lord God, I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but rather that the wicked should turn from his way and live. Turn back from your evil ways. Why then will you die, O house of Israel?" You know, when you think about God's words here and you read the lament of David, it reminds us that God doesn't take any pleasure in the downfall or destruction, even of the wicked. We're not to rejoice in another person's failures. We're not to rejoice when the wicked are consumed. Every life is precious to God. Every person is made in the image of God. And so this is just a good lesson from David, that even though he suffered personally and greatly at the hands of King Saul, he spoke highly of him. He refused to curse the man who pained him. He refused to rejoice over his fall. Well, in chapter 2 now, 2 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 1, we read that David's next steps of becoming king. Because Saul's gone. It's time for David. David's already been anointed by Samuel. David's next steps of becoming king were directed by the Lord. So just as David did not assume himself in the role of king under Saul's rule, right, and just come and say, "Hey, I'm the Lord's anointed, get out of the way," David continued to lay his life in the hands of the Lord. And so David and his family go to Hebron, and his first act is to recognize and commend the men who did the honorable thing of gathering the bodies of Saul and Jonathan and Saul's other son, and to bury them, to show them honor and respect. Well, you would think, you would imagine, excuse me, as you're reading along here, that this is finally going to be it. This is finally going to be the moment that David finds peace. Saul is gone. The battle's over. David finally gets to rest and be at peace back in Israel and in his hometown, his homeland. But that's not the plan. That's not what happens. No, Satan is still at work here. And so Abner, Saul's commander, Abner took Ishbosheth, one of Saul's remaining sons, still alive, and he makes Ishbosheth the king over Gilead, down in verse 8. He might have done this out of loyalty to Saul. He might have done this perhaps to maintain his own influence in Israel. And perhaps he did this just out of a lingering hate for David. Maybe the jealousy and suspicion and hatred that Saul felt, maybe some of that trickled into Saul's commander. Well, his kingdom included Jezreel, Ephraim, and Benjamin, and over all Israel. And David was the king in Hebron. You look down in verse 11. He was in Hebron for 7 years and for 6 months. So what happens then, as we kind of turn over to chapter 3, this kind of where it's all leading into, is that Israel is now engaged in a civil war. Abner, now Ishbosheth's general, and Joab, David's general, they meet up. And it started very innocently. We're in chapter 3. So Ishbosheth's general Abner, David's general Joab meet up. And at first, it's just this contest, this skirmish, this silly, harmless bout between each other's soldiers. But it ended up turning into a bloody duel. And to make matters far worse, Abner ends up killing Joab's brother. His name was Asahel. And tension continues to escalate and explode between the two camps. Well, at this time, if you see in chapter 3 and verse 1, David grows stronger and stronger and stronger, whereas the house of Saul grows weaker and weaker and weaker. Abner is growing in terms of his influence and his position, especially among those who simply supported Saul's household. And so apparently to promote his growth and his power, it included taking Saul's concubine, whose name was Rizpah. But when Saul's son Ishbosheth hears about this, he confronts him on it. Verse 7. And Abner snaps. Abner snaps at him. He says, for all that he's done, for all he's done for this boy, and for the house of Saul for all these years, why could Abner not have this one liberty, this one freedom? And so that was a straw that broke the straw that broke the back for the relationship between these two, Ishbosheth and Abner. And so for all that he's done, for all he's done in the house of Saul, is this how he's going to be treated? So Abner leaves. Abner leaves Ishbosheth and he goes to David. Of all places and of all people, he goes to David and he expresses his desire to partner with David, to offer his allegiance to David. We are here in chapter 3. Read with me. We're in verse 9. Let's read this together. Verse 9 of chapter 3, it says, God, do so to Abner, and more so, if I do not accomplish for David what the Lord has sworn to him, to transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul, and to set up the throne of David over Israel and over Judah, from Dan to Beersheba. It's interesting that even Abner understood, and he knew that this was part of God's plan. He and Saul all those years were trying to keep God's plan from coming true, that David was going to take the throne. Well, this is exactly what happens. Abner meets with David, who conditions the meeting on the return of his first wife, Michal. See, Michal had been given to another man by Saul. Saul, out of his anger and jealousy, was not going to let Michal be given to David. She stayed with Saul, and so she was given to another man whose name was Palti. You can read that story back in 1 Samuel 25. So one of the conditions of David meeting with Abner to talk about this sort of a union is that he wanted his first wife back. He wanted Michal back. Perhaps he wanted Michal back because, well, they were still married. It could also be that David wanted to honor the house of Saul. And so he wanted to bring Michal back into his house as a way that he could maybe erase some of the tension between the two sides. Even though it was obvious their relationship would never be what it was before. Well, two things happen. Two things happen with Abner. One, Abner meets with the elders of Israel and he tells them to make David the king, verses 18 and 19. He admits it was all part of God's plan, and he spoke in a hearing of the people that this is it. This is what's going to happen. David will be the king. So Abner finally admitted what he knew to be true about God's promise to the throne. Second thing is that David threw a feast for Abner. And so verses 20 and 21. Food is so communal. Food is just this easy recognizable form of fellowship and peace. And so David offers this peaceful, it's a peaceful treaty, if you will, an act of kindness and grace on his part. And so Abner does the same. Abner comes offering this olive branch. David comes and offers his feast. Well, all of this is not sitting good with Joab. Remember, Joab is David's commander. Joab's brother was killed by Abner. So David and Joab have two very different views of Abner. Joab felt that Abner could not be trusted. If you look down at verse 24 and 25. Felt like he could not be trusted. This was largely motivated to Abner's role in murdering his brother. He just could not let that go. David chose to see the good in Abner. He trusted him. He took him at his word. But that's so David. David is able to see the good in others and to to forgive another's faults, to offer grace. That was one thing that's so beautiful about David, was his strength of heart to be able to overlook a person's flaws and to look for the good and to see the good. Well, here you go. You got a king and a commander seeing at odds. David's throwing this peace treaty, this peace meal. Joab decides instead to act on his own hurt, and so he murders Abner. Verses 27 through 30. And David responds like a king after God's own heart. I mean, here is a man. Here's Abner, a man who has been Saul's right-hand man, this general of Saul's armies, who has been involved in chasing and pursuing David for years. And after hearing about Abner's death, what's David do? Well, down in verse 32 through 36, he mourns. He mourns and he laments. You notice in verse 38 how David describes Abner. Says, the king said to his servants, do you not know that a prince and a great man has fallen this day in Israel? He calls him a prince and a great man. What honor and respect he shows on Abner. He also recognizes the bad in verse 39. The bad not in Abner. No, at what point would it be in bringing up the bad of a dead man? No, he brings up the bad in his own general. Verse 39, he says, and I was gentle today, the anointed king. These men, the son of Zeruiah, are more severe than I. The Lord repay the evildoer according to his wickedness. That's Joab. Joab and his brothers, the sons of Zeruiah, they answered evil with evil. And that's something that David knew all about. David knew about that temptation all too well. David knew what it was like to be able to be tempted to take someone's life when you feel like they deserve it. Evil is never overcome with evil. It only spreads further harm. It only spreads the fire further. Consumes the good in others. Well, in chapter 4 then of 2 Samuel, it tells us how David then became the king over all of Israel. Because here's what happens. Abner is dead. You still have the divided civil war of Israel. What happens then is that two servants of Ishbosheth, Saul's sons, they come and they kill him, down in verse 7 and verse 8. And so it's from here that all the tribes of David come to make him king. They all finally rally around David. The shepherd from the fields of Judea is now the shepherd over all of God's people, to rule over all of Israel. So here David at age 37 becomes the king of Israel with the full support of all the people. If you see in chapter 5 and verse 1, he has the full and complete support of all the people. And that's our story. That's our context today. We can't end here though. We need to make a point, something that kind of runs through these chapters. Because one theme here that you read through these several chapters of the opening of 2 Samuel is just the focus on murder after murder after murder. There's a lot of murder in these 4 chapters. And the thing is, each murder seems to be justified by the murderer. Until the Amalekite claimed to kill Saul for David's sake. Abner killed Abishai out of sport or contest. Joab kills Abner, saying that he can't be trusted. But he justifies it also as he's taking revenge for his brother. Ishbosheth is murdered to make David the king and to bring vengeance on Saul's home. Well, that's a really dangerous mindset. It's the ends justify the means. It's dangerous because it starts with the good, and it assumes that because an outcome is good, any path to achieve it must be okay, must be allowable, must be justifiable. But it completely ignores the damage, the sin that takes place in order to achieve what we might call good. We sometimes we call it the Robin Hood mentality. It's okay if I rob from the rich, if I do something good with that money, if I give it to the poor. Well, says who? See, the reality is any good that could be achieved through wrongful action is ultimately never good. That's not good. No. You see, David responded, this man, now this king after God's own heart, he responded to each case appropriately, with mourning and with justice. To two, he exacted justice right there on the spot. To Joab and chapter 3 and verse 39, he left him in the hands of the Lord. But he never saw the good in their actions. He saw the evil. David refused to rejoice in anything, in any evil and any sin that was committed, even for his behalf, because sin is never anything to rejoice in. The ends don't justify the means. Evil is never overcome with evil. Evil is overcome with good. And so there's someone worth emulating in these chapters. It's not the men who tried to do good things for David. No, it was David. David who knew and trusted in God's promise that he would be king, but he would be king in God's way, in God's time. God knew the path to the throne, even though it was a path that would lead him through Hebron and even through a civil war, but he was going to trust in God's way and trust in God's time. The ends don't justify the means. Overcome evil, not with evil, but with good. Thank you so much for studying with me today. I hope this study has been encouraging for you.